A prison guard raised his hand to strike a black prisoner on Robben Island. What happened next would define not just that man's 27 years behind bars, but the future of an entire nation. The prisoner's response, delivered without raising his voice, was so devastating that the guard lowered his hand and never touched him. The words Nelson Mandela spoke in that moment would echo through decades of oppression. "You dare touch me, I will take you to the highest court in this land, and by the time I'm finished with you, you will be as poor as a church mouse." If this story of unshakable dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization moves you, subscribe for more untold moments that reveal what true character looks like when the world isn't watching. Drop a comment about a time when someone's calm response to aggression changed everything. 7 kilometers off Cape Town's coast, where frigid Atlantic waters churn against jagged rocks and great white sharks patrol the depths, sits a small, wind-swept island that became apartheid's most notorious prison, Robben Island. The name alone was enough to make men fall silent. For centuries, this desolate outcrop served as a place of banishment. Lepers were sent there to die. Colonial prisoners were exiled there to be forgotten. By the 1960s, the apartheid government transformed it into something far more calculated, a laboratory designed to break the spirits of black political prisoners and crush the leaders of the resistance movement. The regime believed that isolation, brutal labor, and systematic humiliation would destroy these men. They believed that by cutting off these leaders from the outside world, by subjecting them to conditions designed to strip away every vestige of humanity, they would emerge, if they emerged at all, as broken shells, warnings to anyone who might dare oppose white rule. They were catastrophically wrong. But they didn't know that yet. On the night of June 12, 1964, 7 men were loaded onto a military aircraft under cover of darkness. Hours earlier, they had stood in the dock of Pretoria's Palace of Justice and heard the words meant to end their lives in all but the literal sense: life imprisonment for sabotage against the state. Among them was a 45-year-old lawyer named Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Born in 1918 in the rural village of Mvezo in the Eastern Cape, Mandela grew up listening to tribal elders speak around evening fires, their voices filled with stories of ancestral valor, lost kingdoms, and the dream of African unity. His father, a respected chief and advisor to the Tembu royal house, instilled in him the values of dignity and resolve. But education opened Mandela's eyes to the brutal machinery of oppression that governed his country. In 1948, the National Party came to power and instituted apartheid, a system of racial segregation so comprehensive, so dehumanizing, that it controlled where black South Africans could live, work, travel, and even which park benches they could sit on. Past laws required black citizens to carry identification documents at all times. Failure to produce them on demand meant arrest. The regime sought not just segregation, but something more insidious: to convince black South Africans of their own inferiority, to make them complicit in their own subjugation. Mandela joined the African National Congress in 1944, rising quickly through its ranks. After the 1960 Sharpeville massacre, in which police gunned down 69 peaceful protesters, Mandela concluded that non-violent resistance alone could not defeat apartheid. He co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, and went underground, living as an outlaw. "One has to plan every action, however small," Mandela later wrote. "Nothing is innocent, everything is questioned. I became a creature of the night. In August 1962, he was captured. In the Rivonia trial that followed, facing charges that carried the death penalty, Mandela chose not to testify, but to speak from the dock. For nearly 3 hours, he held the court spellbound. His closing words became one of the 20th century's most famous statements. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. His lawyers had begged him to remove that final line, fearing it would provoke the judge into ordering his execution. Mandela refused. As he spoke those words, he looked the judge directly in the eyes, the last eye contact between them during the trial. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. When prisoners arrived on Robben Island, they were ordered to strip completely naked. Their clothes were thrown into water, and they were forced to put them back on while still soaking wet. In the bitter cold of the Cape winter, this was the first salvo in a campaign of systematic dehumanization. Mandela was placed in Section B, the isolation wing for political prisoners, in a cell measuring 8 feet by 7 feet. A thin mat on the concrete floor served as his bed. A bucket served as his toilet. A single mesh-covered bulb burned day and night. There would be no darkness, no escape even into sleep. The rules were precise in their cruelty. Black prisoners received smaller food rations than colored or Indian prisoners. They were forbidden to wear long pants, only shorts, as if to reduce grown men to the status of boys. They were permitted 1 letter and 1 30-minute visit every 6 months. When Mandela's mother died in 1968 and his eldest son in a car accident in 1969, he was denied permission to attend their funerals. One guard even left a newspaper clipping in his cell, an article about the government's mistreatment of his wife, Winnie, just to taunt him, to remind him of his powerlessness. It was against this backdrop that Mandela's first confrontation with the prison system occurred. The incident happened during Mandela's first incarceration on the island in May 1963. A warder, trained to view black prisoners as subhuman, approached Mandela with aggression. The warder raised his hand, preparing to strike. What happened next confounded everything the apartheid system had prepared him for. Mandela did not cower. He did not beg. He did not respond with violence. Standing perfectly still, he spoke with what witnesses described as steely, aristocratic calm. "You dare touch me, I will take you to the highest court in this land, and by the time I'm finished with you, you will be as poor as a church mouse." The warder froze. The script of the interaction had been shattered. He was trained to deal with fear. Prisoners who begged, who submitted. He was trained to deal with violence. Prisoners who fought back and could be beaten into submission. But dignity, calm assertion of fundamental rights, legal threat delivered with perfect composure, he had no training for that. The warder lowered his hand. He stepped back, and Nelson Mandela walked to his cell untouched. Years later, Mandela reflected with characteristic honesty. "I was frightened. It was not because I was courageous, but one had to put up a front, and so he stopped." This admission makes the moment even more remarkable. Mandela understood that dignity, even performed dignity, has its own power, that standing one's ground, even when afraid, can change the terms of engagement, that the oppressor's power depends partly on the oppressed accepting their own diminishment. From that moment forward, Mandela would never accept it. What followed was not a single moment of resistance, but a sustained campaign lasting nearly 2 decades on Robben Island. He established a principle. They could imprison his body, but they could not force him to participate in his own humiliation. When prisoners performed backbreaking labor in the limestone quarry, work so brutal that the reflected sunlight permanently damaged many prisoners' eyes, including Mandela's, he organized. The quarry became Robben Island University, where prisoners whispered lessons in law, economics, and political theory while smashing rocks under the African sun. When black prisoners were denied long pants while others received them, Mandela protested systematically. By 1966, the rule was changed. A small victory, but victories matter. He learned the names of God's children. He studied Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, to understand their mindset. He treated even hostile warders with a courtesy that confused them, forcing them to confront the humanity of the man they had been taught to despise. Every time a guard sees you angry, it's a victory for the guard, Mandela observed. His mission became earning respect, and he discovered that to get respect, one must give it. One guard who changed was Christo Brand, a young Afrikaner who arrived in 1978. Raised to believe black South Africans were inferior and the ANC were terrorists, Brand found something different. I helped him grow tomatoes and other vegetables in his little garden, Brand later recalled, and I gave him respect that he had never had before in his prison treatment. Brand smuggled letters between Mandela and his family. He risked his career to maintain a connection that defied everything apartheid stood for. This was Mandela's genius, transforming the prison into a space of moral education, turning captivity into a slow demonstration that apartheid's view of black South Africans was a lie. On February 11th, 1990, after 27 years, 6 months, and 6 days of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison a free man. The moment was broadcast to billions worldwide. What the cameras captured was a man who should have emerged broken, bitter, consumed by rage. 27 years of his life stolen, his children's childhoods missed, his mother and son buried without him. Instead, Mandela emerged with his fist raised and ready to forgive. As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, he later wrote, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. Bill Clinton once pressed him, tell me the truth, when you were walking to freedom, didn't you hate them? Mandela answered honestly, yes, briefly I did. I hated them, and I was afraid. And then I realized if I still hated them after I left, they would still have me. I wanted to be free, and so I let it go. So, on May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood on the steps of the Union buildings in Pretoria, for decades the seat of white supremacy, and was inaugurated as South Africa's first democratically elected president. 4,000 guests attended, including world leaders from across the globe. South African jets roared overhead in formation. 1 billion viewers watched worldwide, but the moment that captured his essence came in a quieter gesture. Among his invited guests were 3 white prison warders from Robben Island, men who had guarded his cell, men who had been part of the system designed to break him. Mandela had personally ensured they received invitations. At the VIP lunch, Mandela praised these warders who had learned to see human beings as human beings. One was Christo Brand, the guard who had helped tend his garden. "I invited him as a symbol of the power of forgiveness and reconciliation," Mandela explained. A year later, he invited Percy Utah, the prosecutor who had demanded the death penalty at the Rivonia trial, to dinner. They shared a kosher meal. Mandela told him he had only been doing his job, and in perhaps the most powerful symbolic act of his presidency, Mandela donned the Springbok jersey, long a symbol of white South African identity, at the 1995 Rugby World Cup final. When South Africa won, Mandela presented the trophy to Afrikaner captain Francois Pienaar. Mandela won the hearts of millions of white rugby fans, F.W. de Klerk observed. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. He had established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which allowed South Africa to confront its past without descending into vengeance, served one term as president, and stepped down voluntarily because he believed true leadership meant knowing when to pass the torch. But his greatest legacy may be the lesson of that first confrontation on Robben Island, when a terrified prisoner stood his ground against a guard's raised hand and spoke with the calm certainty of a man who knew his own worth. The apartheid system was built on a lie, that some human beings were worth less than others, that dignity could be stripped away through law and violence, that the human spirit could be broken if you applied enough pressure. Mandela proved them wrong. Not through violence alone, though he had accepted its necessity. Not through hatred, though he had every reason to hate. But through something more enduring. The absolute refusal to accept a diminished view of his own humanity. "Any man or institution that tries to rob me of my dignity will lose," he told friends after that first confrontation. For 27 years, the apartheid regime tried to rob him of his dignity. They failed, and in failing, they planted the seeds of their own destruction. The cell where Mandela spent 18 years, 8 feet by 7 feet, with its concrete floor and its bucket toilet, still stands today, part of the Robben Island Museum, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by thousands each year. Some of the tour guides are former political prisoners who served alongside Mandela. 3 former inmates of Robben Island have gone on to become president of South Africa. The prison designed to end the anti-apartheid movement instead incubated its victory. That is the lesson of Robben Island. That is the power of one man who refused to bow.